Hello and welcome back to the Engerati studio after our panel discussion just beforehand on customer engagement, which you can watch again on the website. I'm joined now by Dr. Sascha Brozek, who's part of Siemens Building Technologies. So just to give you a break, we aren't going to talk that much about smart grid and smart grid technologies. We're going to do something else, but the smart grid is relevant. In the sense that we're building the smart grid out, and surely the smart grid is just one dimension. We need to actually go a bit further and develop the buildings into that entire ecosystem in order to have all these end-to-end efficiencies that are theoretically possible.
I think that's exactly the point. I think a smart grid concept focuses on an end-to-end perspective. End-to-end, A, on the distribution of energy, and B, also on the data communication between the consumers, which can be residential, commercial buildings, or industrial buildings, and on the utilities and distribution companies on the other side. And so we believe that the smart grid really makes sense with the objective not only to manage the grid more intelligently, but also to be able to reduce energy consumption, optimize energy consumption, and provide secure energy provision. Buildings of all type would play a major role in this ecosystem.
And is that, so let me ask a naive question here. I mean, why can't I have and we talked about it off air, what was it? It used to be called intelligent buildings, now it's smart buildings, and it may end up being called living buildings or whatever it's called. Why can't we have that as an entity and the smart grid as an entity, and why do we need to make that connection? Why do we need to make that link? What's the benefit?
I think there's two aspects. A, maybe we start with the benefit first. There's a significant number of different stakeholders in this industry when we talk about smart grid. At the end, for every stakeholder, there has to be a business case behind which makes commercial sense. Of course, we talk about substantial investments, and investments are only taken if there's business cases supporting these investments. So on one side, we have the grid, the utilities, which are focusing on better transparency and managing the challenge of increasing degree of renewables, and especially the avoidance of excess capacity which they need to build. On the other side, we have buildings as the predominant consumer of electricity. Roughly 40% of energy consumption of energy generation is consumed in buildings globally. So, but if you talk about buildings, you're immediately involved in a large number of stakeholders. Let's take commercial buildings, because this is a predominant player in the future for smart grids. Again, there's a difference between new buildings, which are freshly constructed, and existing buildings. For Europe, North America, and Northeast Asia, the existing buildings are more important because the majority of the building infrastructure is already built. For other areas which are still developing, new construction plays a role. Take new construction. So you have, just in the new construction place, there's around 10 different stakeholders. It starts with the investor or owner of the future building, the general contractor, the planners, the specialized planners, and then the technology providers behind. And there's different objectives of all of these stakeholders. So this has nothing to do with smart grid, it's just all the reality of the construction industry. Focus typically is on minimizing investment versus looking on TCO, total cost of ownership, over the life cycle of a building. So here we already have a challenge, but the real potential for smart grid is with existing buildings. Let's take Northern Europe again as an example. 99% is built. So here we talk with different stakeholders from a building perspective. Again, it's building owners, tenants, because in many cases buildings are occupied by different type of tenants in commercial office buildings, for example. You have the facility management groups, you have the technology providers, you have the service companies. And again, to bring these to common perspective is not an easy play. And again, it all comes back to the question, okay, how can we generate or respectively save money?
Yeah, and on that side of things, I mean, what are you? I mean, you've described the complexity of the actors involved. You know, tenants to the owners of the buildings and so on. But let's assume for a second you've got all of them in a room, and you are able to talk to all of them and give your pitch. You know, let's construct this building. It's an existing building. It's a multi-story building, and they're all here. What is it that you would say to them that they need to do, and then people don't do anything without a real crystallization of the benefit? So, and what's that? I mean, what's that real benefit? Why should I bother, I suppose?
Good point. Yeah. So typically we have a core message which is towards customers, whatever type of building you have, you always can increase your energy efficiency by this saving costs. This is a core benefit typically for most of the stakeholders involved here. Transferring this to smart grid, typically we would engage in a discussion with a building owner or building facility management to participate in smart grid programs, especially with demand response programs. It's not so much a question of technology, because technology in the building is relatively straightforward. It's more the challenge to bring in sufficient load. A single commercial building typically can give you maybe a shiftable or switchable load in the range of 10 to 20 kilowatt. That's not a lot. So it only makes sense if you bring up, let's say, 1,000 buildings in a city or part of the city. So 1,000 buildings would then give you 10 megawatt, which already is an interesting load comparable to large industrial loads. So the challenge now which comes in again means you need to talk with 1,000 individual customers to make this program play. And this leads to the core model of aggregators, so demand response aggregators in special, who take this role to bring in these different subscribers into, for example, demand response program.
But isn't that a slightly, so if you're saying the real benefit or a bigger benefit can only be realized when you start getting to the scale of 1,000 people, isn't that just adding more complexity on the challenge, whereby you're saying, well, actually, you as an individual building aren't that interesting, but 1,000 buildings are interesting. So aren't you kind of making more work for yourself in terms of getting this whole sort of building technologies conversation going? Where's the simple silver bullet that you can go in and say, well, if you do this, you are able to do X?
Okay, good. Very good point. So what we typically engage with customers, and let's put smart grid for a moment to the side,
sure,
is talk with building operators and owners about building efficiency of their single building. Let's stay with a single building for a moment. And there are business models which were relatively easy. It's called performance contracting, or energy performance contracting, or ESCO. So these words are used in synonym, where Siemens, but also other companies, do an energy assessment of the building, put up a number of proposals, like you can change your chiller plant, you can optimize your control systems, you might participate in a demand response program, package it for the customer, calculate an ROI model, and then the customer can make a decision, yes, I want to do, or I don't want to do this. That's actually a traditional business which has been done already since 10 to 15 years, predominantly in North America, because they were advanced in the business model. In Europe, it's starting during the last few years. So this would typically be our first engagement with a single customer. And participating in a demand response program of a smart grid concept is just one of a number of measures a customer can implement.
So isn't that one of the issues? Because if the demand response program or the variable tariff program is a key component of the ROI metric, aren't you guys sat here waiting for all of that to be offered? I mean, we had a panel session earlier where people were saying, well, actually, we haven't got those tariffs yet in the majority of Europe. So does that take away too significant a ROI equation, or can you still get a return by not having that? So in the conversation, I'm trying to take away variables just to see where the lowest common denominator is.
For standard performance contracting or energy efficiency program, you don't need necessarily to have a smart grid component. In most cases, actually, there isn't a smart grid component. It's just an additional facility. So the business case, in many cases, for standard commercial buildings, still is valid. It might be 4 years, 6 years, or 2 years of payback, depends on the customer decision mechanisms. But you even can combine it with financing, for example. So this would make it CapEx free in terms of investment. So that's why this market already has developed and is further developing, because it creates for the building operator the benefit to reduce energy cost. To put this further again into the domain of future smart grid, the points which are missing were exactly what you mentioned. Stable regulations, the role of an aggregator, putting together more than one building, so that it makes commercial sense also for utility to engage. And we believe that especially utilities will go more and more in the role of aggregators, potentially also telecommunication companies or special purpose companies in that sense. So this is the reason why we don't see today, even if it's very obvious to make sense to hook up, let's say, thousands of buildings into a smart grid program, why this is not happening. It's only happening in pilot projects, which are mostly around technology demonstration or business case demonstrations. So, but once we have, from the regulatory side, a much better spread on energy prices, so the business case become more attractive, and B, stable regulations for the role of aggregators, for example, we believe this market will really go off the roof.
Yeah, because I think you mentioned earlier on an ROI, and we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, but you mentioned an ROI length, and I just want to press you on that. Is that based on sort of real world, or did you just pluck 2 years and 4 years just as an example? Mm-hmm. But is 2 years and 4 years a real sort of length of time to get ROI on this? Okay.
This depends on the scope of an energy improvement project. Mm-hmm. So we see ROIs between 2 years all the way up to 10 years. And then it depends a little bit. The public area is more tendency towards longer term of ROIs because they have longer term perspective, whereas private sector typically looks for ROIs between 2 to 4 years. So it limits some of the measures you can implement. Let's take again in building, you propose change of the facade to provide better energy isolation. This typically has long-term ROIs. To do an improvement on a control system, it's a low investment and gives very short-term ROIs. Second point I really like to stress is this is not only a paper calculation, because most of these programs are, in many cases at least, are called guaranteed performance contracts.
Right.
So it means you enter into with a customer, or even better, a customer with a number of facilities, and guarantee the savings on it. But to do this, you need to measure it, control it, and have a proper contractual model between the building operator and place.
So you guys are really, you're really talking about a service-orientated model as well. You're saying we'll take the risk, we'll put our necks on the line and say you are going to save X, and you pay us based on reward. So I can't understand why people aren't falling over their feet to do this. I mean, where's the risk for them if you're willing to enter into that sort of agreement?
The risk is very limited for the building owner or building operator. Just thinking of TCO, total cost of ownership, or life cycle calculations is not so far developed in the European domain like it is in North America. Mm. And that's why the market for ESCO business or performance contracting North America is already in the multi-billion-dollar regime, whereas in Europe it's only in the couple of $100 million. But It's growing very fast.
Right. So we need that market to and people to start thinking slightly differently, which you say is at a tipping point in terms of that. And Sascha, it's great to have you in the studio, and thanks for your time as well. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the time we've got here, and thank you as well for watching. And remember, on Engerati, you can also not only see this video, I'd like to point you to a link with a webinar we did with you where we went into a bit more detail around this subject as well. I'd encourage you to watch that as well as some of the other presentations that we've got. So thank you again for watching, and thanks again for your time.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.